You wake up before the light does. There's no fire yet, just the gray smell of last night's ash and the cold pressing in from every direction at once. Not on your hands, not on your feet, on all of you, top to bottom, because there's almost nothing between your skin and the air. A little hair on your head, a little here and there. The rest of you is just out. Bare. You are the only animal for 100 miles built like this, shivering on a continent full of creatures that solved the cold 1,000,000 years before you ever showed up. The deer have coats. The lions have coats. The mice burrowed in the grass 3 feet away have better insulation than you do. You have goosebumps and a vague sense of betrayal. And here's the part that stays strange no matter how long you turn it over. Out of every mammal that has ever lived, almost the only ones that go around effectively naked are hiding from the problem some other way. Moles underground, whales underwater, that kind of thing. Out in the open air, walking upright in the wind and the sun, there is basically one, us. We are, in the most literal biological sense, the weird hairless thing, an animal that cools itself by sweating and grows no coat at all to do it in. Every other big mammal on the savanna carries its insulation around for free, built right in at the factory. We're the species that has to put ours on by hand every single morning and peel it off again every single night. So at some point, this naked animal looks down at a dead deer or at a scraped hide stiffening in the sun and has a thought that no creature on earth had ever had before. I could wear that. This is the story of when that thought happened, when we stopped being naked. And the strangest part of it isn't the date. It's how we dug the date up, because our single best clue didn't come from a grave, or a painting, or a tool. It came from lice. Hold on to that, because before we get there, we have to deal with the answer you've probably already got loaded in your head. If someone stops you on the street and asks when humans started wearing clothes, the picture that surfaces is something in a museum case. A bone needle, thin as a matchstick, with a tiny hole drilled in one end. Ice Age. Maybe 40,000 years old. A fur-wrapped hunter, somewhere in a snowbound Europe, stitching a coat to keep from freezing. And that's a completely reasonable picture. Most of what you'll read says more or less exactly that, and the needles are real. The oldest dyed ones we found turn up in Siberia around 40,000 years ago. In the Caucasus a couple thousand years before that. In Europe a good deal later. You can hold those dates in your hand. They're carved into actual objects in actual drawers. Here's the crack running through it though. A needle is not clothing. A needle is the last lucky survivor of a thing that almost never survives at all. Hide, fur, plant fiber, sinew, thread. The actual stuff that clothing is made of rots. It's gone in a few thousand years, often a lot less, swallowed back into the ground without a trace. So when you find a 40,000-year-old needle, you have not found the moment clothing began. You found the moment somebody happened to drop a sliver of bone hard enough to outlast everything soft around it. The real starting line is somewhere behind that, back in the dark, and the needle simply cannot tell you how far back. To find that line, you have to stop digging in the dirt and start looking at something alive. So think about a louse for a second. Really think about where it lives. The head louse, the one that comes home as a note from your kid's school, lives in hair. That's its entire universe. It grips the hairs, lays its egg cemented to the hairs, feeds on the scalp, and never leaves. Now picture the human body below the neck. There's no real hair down there to speak of. We covered that. The bare skin is the whole problem we started with. For a head louse, the rest of you is a desert. Nothing to hold on to, nowhere to anchor an egg, nothing but exposed open ground. Uninhabitable. And then, somewhere in the human story, it became habitable. A second kind of louse turns up, the body louse, sometimes called the clothing louse, and it does something its cousin physically cannot. It lives in your clothes. It tucks its eggs into the seams and the weave of the fabric, crawls onto the skin to feed, crawls back into the cloth to hide. It is built, down to its anatomy, for a world in which humans wear things. Which means it could not have drawn a single breath before humans wore things. No clothing, no niche. No niche, no louse. The body louse is a creature that is only possible because we got dressed. So the impossible question, when did we start wearing clothes, quietly turns into a question you can actually answer. When did the body louse split off from the head louse? David Reed, who studies lice at the Florida Museum of Natural History, spent 5 years chasing exactly that, reading the DNA of lice gathered from people all over the planet to clock the moment the two lineages parted. The answer came back, at least 83,000 years ago, possibly as far back as 170,000. A parasite is the oldest receipt we have for human clothing, and it predates that famous museum needle by something like 4 times over. Now you should always be a little suspicious of one clever study, and the scientists were too. So it's worth knowing the lice trick didn't start with Reed. Back in 2003, a team led by the geneticist Mark Stoneking, working out of the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig, ran the first version of it and landed on a date around 107,000 years ago. Different samples, different methods, the better part of a decade apart, and they keep pointing into the same long-ago window. When 2 roads you built separately drop you in the same valley, the valley is probably really there. But the date isn't even the strangest part. The strangest part is where it falls. 100 and some thousand years ago, modern humans were still in Africa. The Great Migration out into the cold of Europe and Asia comes tens of thousands of years later than that. Which means we were already dressed something like 70,000 years before we ever set foot in a climate that demanded a coat. Read that twice. We did not invent clothing to survive the Ice Age. We walked into the Ice Age already wearing it. Whatever first drove a naked animal to cover itself happened under the African sun, in a place where freezing to death was never once the danger. And that cracks the whole common sense story wide open, because if it wasn't the cold, then what on earth was it for? Shade against a sun that could blister bare skin. A barrier between you and the things that bite. A sling to carry an infant. Or, and this is the one that gets interesting, something to be worn in the oldest sense of that word. Something to be seen in. And to feel how genuinely odd that is, you have to go back even further, past the clothes, past the lice, to the bare body underneath them. We were not always naked. Somewhere around 1 to 2 million years ago, our ancestors in the genus Homo shed their fur, and the leading explanation is almost comic in how mundane it is. We were overheating. Nina Jablonski, an anthropologist who has spent her whole career on human skin, makes the case that once our ancestors started walking and running long distances across hot, open savanna, a thick coat of fur became a liability. It trapped heat we desperately needed to dump. So we lost it, and bet everything on sweat instead. The dark skin came in right behind it, evolving as a built-in sunscreen for the newly exposed hide. A geneticist at the University of Utah, Alan Rogers, traced the gene responsible back roughly 1.25 million years. Run that math, and it knocks the wind out of you a little. We were walking the earth bare-skinned. No fur, no clothes, nothing, for upward of 1 million years. Clothing, even at the most generous lice-given date, is something we've done for maybe the last 10 or 15% of our naked existence. For the overwhelming bulk of the time we've been recognizably us, we wore absolutely nothing. And we were completely fine. Clothing isn't some primal birthright we've always had. It's a late arrival, a recent idea. And that reframes something you carry around without ever noticing it. The deep, almost physical discomfort you'd feel walking out your front door with nothing on. That reflex isn't ancient at all. Your body spent most of its evolutionary life with exactly that much on and never flinched. The shame, the second skin, the whole instinct to cover up. That's the new part. The naked part is the original you. So if it's that old and almost never survives, are the lice all we've got? Not quite. The dirt does hand us something. Not the clothes themselves, but the tools that shape them. And those tools run a lot older than the famous needles. Long before anyone bothered drilling an eye into a piece of bone, people were working hide with awls. And an awl is just a needle without the eye, a sharpened point of bone you punch through skin to join two pieces together. In the caves of southern Africa, at sites like Blombos and Sibidu, those all show up around 70,000 years ago and earlier. Same continent, same deep stretch of time the lice keep pointing to. Two completely unrelated kinds of evidence, a parasite's DNA and a sharpened bone in a cave, quietly shaking hands across the dark. Which raises a fair question. If the humble all already made clothes, why on earth invent the eyed needle at all? It's fussy, delicate, slow to make. Why not stick with the tool that already works? Ian Gilligan, an archaeologist at the University of Sydney, who's written the book on the prehistory of clothing, has a wonderfully unglamorous answer. The eyed needle shows up right as the climate starts slamming back and forth, savagely cold and fast. And what saves you in that kind of cold isn't a cloak thrown loose over the shoulders. It's a tight inner layer, fine, close stitching that traps a film of warm air right against the skin. Gilligan's blunt version is that the eyed needle, in the end, is really about inventing underwear. The most advanced sewing technology of the Stone Age, and we built it to make the first base layer. Then the very same tool turns around and does something that has nothing to do with warmth whatsoever. Around 40,000 years ago, the archaeological record starts filling up with beads, pierced shells, carved bone, little ivory ornaments, and a great many of them were sewn onto clothing. The needle that was keeping you alive was suddenly also stitching tiny signals onto the outside of you, out where everyone could see them. This is the quiet hinge the whole story turns on. Clothing stops being only a thing that holds the heat in and starts becoming a thing that says something, a surface you can read. The moment we could decorate what we wore, an outfit stopped being insulation and started being a sentence, a way to tell a stranger across the firelight, before either of you opened your mouth, who you were and where you stood. Status, tribe, skill, spoken for or not. The fur that kept you from freezing was now also doing the work that a uniform, a wedding ring, and a designer label all do today, all at once, on the same scrap of stitched hide. We weren't the only humans working this out either. The Neanderthals were in cold Europe long before our species ever arrived, and they dressed for it. But the evidence says they dressed differently. No eyed needle has ever been found at a Neanderthal site. The picture most researchers paint is simpler. A fur cloak, the skin of a single animal wrapped and draped, covering a great deal of the body but not cut, not tailored, not sewn into a second skin. Models of how much they'd have needed to cover suggest up to 80 or 90% of the body in the depth of winter. And there's a small, telling clue hiding in their bones. Kara Okobok, a human biologist at Notre Dame, points out that Neanderthal skeletons don't carry the frostbite damage you'd expect from people that exposed. No fields of missing fingers and toes, which is a quiet argument that they were protecting their hands and feet somehow, even if we are never going to dig up the mittens. The gap between a draped cloak and a stitched garment sounds tiny. It was anything but. Draped fur keeps you alive in a cold place. Tailored, layered, sewn clothing lets you walk into a place that should kill you and stay. Our species, armed with its eyed needles and its fitted inner layers, pushed all the way into the frozen northeastern corner of Eurasia. Ground so brutal that the cold-hardened Neanderthals, for all their thick-bodied toughness, never managed to settle it at the worst of the freeze. A better stitch, a tighter seam, an inner layer that actually held its warm air against the skin. None of that is a footnote in the survival story. It is the survival story. The line between a people who stayed put and a people who could go anywhere came down, in part to who had the better tailoring. We tend to file clothing somewhere near comfort, or vanity, or modesty. For most of the human journey, it sat in a far heavier category than any of those. The technology that decided where on earth a person could physically stand and stay alive. There's a temptation, telling a story like this, to promise you that one day we'll find it. The actual first garment, the real first thing a person ever pulled on. We almost certainly never will. It rotted into nothing 100,000 plus years ago, the way everything soft does. But that's the quietly beautiful thing about all of this. We don't need it. The lice, the awls, the needles, the bare, hairless skin underneath. Separate trails of evidence, gathered by people who weren't even looking for each other's answers, and they all walk us to the same spot. We reconstructed the invisible thing entirely from the things that happened to be standing next to it. So here's where it all lands. This morning, before you were really even awake, you did the thing. You reached for clothes, and you put them on, and you did not think about it for a single second. It's the most automatic move you make in your entire day. Except it wasn't automatic. Somewhere in there, fast and far below the surface, you made choices. This shirt, not that one. This color. Something that fits, something that lands roughly the way you want to land. Something that says a little about who you are before you've said one word to anybody. That exact move, covering the body and quietly deciding what the covering should say about you, is at least 100,000 years old, and maybe closer to 170. The person who wrapped themselves in a hide rubbed with red ochre on some warm African morning, long before anyone on Earth needed a coat, was doing the same two things you did before your coffee this morning. Getting covered and getting seen. And the whole way down that 100,000-year line, riding along in the seams, there's been a tiny passenger that has lived with us so long, it grew an entirely new kind of body just to survive in our clothes. You've been carrying the receipt the entire time. We figured out the day we got dressed by reading the DNA of the bugs that got dressed along with us. That is either kind of elegant or deeply undignified, and I've landed on it being both at once. So here's the one I keep chewing on. If it all came apart tomorrow, no stores, no closet, nothing but raw hides and your own two hands, what's the first thing you'd make? Something to keep you warm, or something to make you look like someone? I really don't know what I'd reach for first, and I think the honest answer says more about a person than they'd ever expect.